Good to go. Yep.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think we shall begin. It is 7 o'clock, and we would like to get started and leave opportunities for questions and visiting and discussions a little bit later on in the meeting. My name is Jim McTavish, and I'm a member of the branch here, and I'm chairing the meeting tonight. And we'd just like to take a few moments, first of all, to give you a little bit of an update as to what's going to be happening in the future and some other bits of information that are important, we think, at this point. And you may probably by now are aware that we do live stream our meetings and record them. The reason for this, I keep saying it, but I think it's important to be aware that in this branch, we have about 150 members. 75% of those members do not live in the Windsor area, but they are members because they have ancestors who came from this area. So by live streaming the meetings, they can be with us electronically. Also, if you miss a meeting, you can go back and record. You can go back and listen to it, watch it at your convenience. So it has been very successful, and we've received a lot of good input in the technological age that we're in. It works very, very well. So a couple of bits of information, just again, for those who may be new to the branch or to the meetings, we do have a website, a Facebook group, and we are on Twitter. So any of this information that you might want to take with you, these slides will be on the front table at the end of the meeting, and you can take a look at them at that point. One other point that I do want to mention, some of you I noticed minutes visiting the back table there are some free magazines on genealogy that you may take with you if you're interested. So please take a look at what is there and see if something is of use to you. New. As I mentioned, you can view the meetings after they have taken place, but there's a restriction put on it now in that after 30 days, they will come offline and will be available on the members only section of the branch website. So just be aware of that. You have a month after the meeting to access it and to get the information that you need. But after that, it will be on the members only website. So upcoming events to keep you informed for the future months. As you know, this is Black History Month, and it's one of the months that, as a society, we do try and promote, and we do try and get people to speak in regard to that particular topic. We usually try and do the same thing for Remembrance Day in November. So we're very pleased to be able to have a presentation on that tonight. This Saturday, if you're interested, there will be a Family Day open house here at the library in the local family history room on the second floor. And it's from 1 to 5. So if it's something that you feel you would like to get involved in, if you have not seen the Family History Center upstairs, this is a good opportunity to come and see what's available there. It's very, very, very helpful, and we'll have people there that can give you advice and ideas in terms of searching your own family tree. Next month, we're going to look at researching ancestors who may have Serbian roots. The Serbian Heritage Museum will be the presenter at next month's meeting. And will that be here, Cindy? It will be here, okay. We're not going to the Serbian Center. Okay, so here next month, March 13th. Again, it's always interesting to find out how to research in a multicultural society, because people do come from all backgrounds. And so this is one that I think will be of interest to some. April, using Google. April 10th presentation, tips and tricks to help you in your search for family history. And in May, we're going on the road, which is something which we've been doing from time to time with the society. This time we're going on a road trip to the French Society. Some of you, if you had a connection with them in the past, you may know that they used to have their center out in Puce, but their center was closed down by the county. And so they now are located in the second floor at Maryvale Convent on Prince Road. A little tricky to get in there, but once you find it, it's no problem. And we're going to go there on a Saturday in place of the usual Monday meeting, Saturday 1 to 3, and they will tell us a little bit about the resources that they have and a chance to opportunity for you to access them and to ask questions as well. Of course, the OGS conference is coming quickly. This is the provincial conference of the Ontario Genealogical Society. It's June the 16th to the 18th in Ottawa, which of course, as many things, have congregated toward Ottawa during the 150th birthday year of Canada. Okay, let's talk about tonight. Tonight, we have Irene Moore Davis. Very pleased to have Irene with us tonight. She's going to speak on the early African Canadian communities in Essex County. And just to give you a little bit of information about Irene, just 1 second. Just didn't bring everything with me here. Sorry about that. I thought it was all in one package. But Irene was, to give you a little bit of her background, she was born and raised in Windsor and is a graduate of the University of Windsor, Queen's University, Western University. She's currently the president of the Essex County Black Historical Research Society and fulfills committee roles with the Amherstburg Freedom Museum. She has Alpha Sorority and other organizations. Irene was part of the writing and editorial team for African Canadian Roads to Freedom, resource manuals which help local teachers integrate Black history into their everyday curriculum. She was a historical consultant on the documentary, The Greatest Freedom Show on Earth, which aired on TVO in 2014-15. And she was one of the several Canadian and US historians to contribute chapters to the award-winning book, A Fluid Frontier, Slavery, Resistance, and the Underground Railroad in the Detroit River Borderland. In her professional life, she's manager of continuing education at St. Clair College, and she lives in Windsor with her husband, Rodney Davis. So would you please welcome Irene Moore Davis.
So happy Black History Month. Do I need this microphone? Do I need the microphone? Some of you are nodding. I do. Okay, I need the microphone. It's such a pleasure to visit the Essex County OGS tonight, and I want to thank Cindy, Jim, and Michelle especially for the invitation. I hope that everybody's aware that for the 14th year in a row, the Essex County Black Historical Research Society has compiled an activity schedule of Black History Month events happening in our region, and you can find that at amherstburgfreedom.org. You just go to calendar, select Black History Month, and you'll find all the gory details there. So as you may know, the national theme of Black History Month 2017 across Canada is Stories of Courage. And some of you may have seen the poster. The official Government of Canada Black History Month poster for this year features Viola Desmond. Of course, everybody's now familiar with Viola Desmond, I think. Her story is certainly centered in Nova Scotia, but closer to home, here in our region, there are also many stories of courage that can enlighten us and inspire us, and sometimes even motivate us to demonstrate courage in our time. And it's great to learn about extraordinary individuals from our region who did remarkable things, but it's also very helpful to just learn about the ordinary people and families and groups and communities and organizations and settlements, the people of African descent in our region who maybe aren't in the history books and aren't featured on websites, but who can still tell us a lot in terms of stories of conflict and coalescence and struggle and triumph. All of those things also deserve our attention. And I always believe that all of our ancestors, whether famous or not, lived lives of courage to a great degree. And their everyday acts of overcoming helped to bring us to this point where we're now such a caring and tolerant nation that the world looks up to. So I recognize that tonight I'm speaking to a room full of people with varying degrees of knowledge and expertise. Some of you have been doing history and genealogy for decades. Some of you are just getting started. I hope everybody will leave this presentation with some nugget of valuable information that you didn't have before. And if not, I hope that I can entertain those of you who know everything already. Before I move on to the general, I want to just sort of place some context around my family in southwestern Ontario and how my ancestors got their start in this region, and then I will move into the core content of the presentation. So I'm only talking about the maternal side of my family because, of course, my father's side is from the Caribbean. But to look at these southwestern Ontario ancestors, it will just sort of give you a sense of how I got involved in looking into some of these communities. Some of you may be familiar with the name Abraham Doris Shadd. There was a Canada Post stamp named after him a few years ago, several years ago now. And he was my great-great-great-grandfather. He came originally from Delaware, lived for a time in Pennsylvania, settled in southwestern Ontario in Raleigh Township, became the first person of African descent elected to political office in Canada, and this is how he got the postage stamp. He's holding a lantern because that's meant to suggest that he was an Underground Railroad operative, both during his time in the United States and as an anti-slavery activist here. Some of you may be familiar with his very famous daughter, Marianne Shadd Carey. Hands up if anybody's familiar with her. And I should acknowledge there are a bunch of people here who are like equally expert in this area. I especially want to acknowledge Dale Carter, Nancy Allen, and Ken Stanton, who are all members of the Essex County Black Historical Research Society along with me, and have done just as much work, if not more, in this area. So Marianne Shadd Carey is a very special person in terms of Windsor history, Chatham-Kent history, Canadian history, US history, Civil War history. I'll touch more on her Windsor activities later when we get to the part about Windsor. But briefly, she was an educator, she was a Civil War recruiter, an anti-slavery activist, a women's suffrage activist, and the first Black woman to publish a newspaper in North America. Her less famous sister was Elizabeth Shadd Shreve. She married George Bolivar Shreve. Bolivar was a middle name he took on for himself because he had great admiration for Bolivar. And I am descended from those two. Another individual from whom I'm descended is Annie Stone Robbins. Yes? Which photo you're referring to. Oh, sorry. Yes, you're right. So underneath Abraham Doris Shadd is Elizabeth Shadd Shreve, one of his many daughters, and her husband, George Bolivar Shreve. She was born in Delaware. They lived in Pennsylvania. They came to Raleigh Township in the 1850s and settled there. Anyone with the surname Shreve that you meet in southwestern Ontario who is a person of African heritage is generally going to be descended from these two. And then Annie Stone Robbins, who's a somewhat larger photo over on the right, her parents escaped from slavery in Tennessee and made their way to Broxton, or the Elgin settlement, and she grew up there. I've always found that a very fascinating photo of my great-great-grandmother because she was born to people who had lived in slavery. It was obviously very important for her to show that she was a literate woman. And that's something that you see very commonly in photos from that time. That these individuals whose parents had been denied education, or who themselves may have been denied education during bondage in the United States, when they arrived in Canada and were living in an attitude of freedom, wanted to show that literacy was one of the things they had attained and that they were learned people. Here in Windsor, my ancestors were the Dunn family. And going from the top left to see a portrait of George Braxton Dunn. Thank you.
You forgot to show me that.
Oh, thank you, Trix. Okay, so George Braxton Dunn was born in slavery in Virginia, was a slave in Kentucky, purchased his freedom near Frankfort, Kentucky, made his way to Cuyahoga County, or the Cleveland area, lived there as a free person for a time, married Mary Clara Jackson, who was also a formerly enslaved person. When the northern codes changed to such a degree that even people who were not in slavery were feeling fearful, were dealing with a lot of oppression, many free people of color decided to cross into Canada West and get out of that situation. And so the Dunns decided to move initially to Fort Erie. They settled for a time in St. Thomas, London, and then made their way to Windsor. He was a barber. They had several children, one of whom was James Llewellyn Dunn. Another one, a younger son, was my great-great-grandfather, Robert Braxton Dunn. James, you may be familiar with if you've studied Black history in this area, because he was the plaintiff in a famous case called Dunn versus the Board of Education of Windsor. His daughter was prevented from attending an integrated school. He sued the Windsor Board of Education unsuccessfully, but shortly thereafter, he became elected as a trustee. And after that, he was elected as Windsor's first Black city councilor, or town councilor. He was a pretty well-to-do man. He had invented a paint and varnish process, and he had a company called Dunn Paint and Varnish. His younger brother, Robert, became a partner in the company and subsequently became the second Black town councilor in Windsor. He served 9 terms.
What year is that?
So James was elected to town council in 1887 through 1889. Robert, I believe it's 1893 to 1901. They had annual elections then. He also ran unsuccessfully for mayor in 1896. And this is just a really cool set of photos in our family collection. I quite enjoy them. They show something of the personality of James. This is a photo that was taken in 1922 in Weigel Park. My great-great-grandfather as an older person, with all of his friends and peers from the Oddfellows. And another Windsor family. These were the Larters. My great-great-grandmother, Nora Larter Dunn, she married Robert Dunn, who I just mentioned. Her parents were Margaret Nelson Larter and John Larter. They were from Indiana. John Larter's family had been enslaved in North Carolina. They made their way to Indiana. They were living in free territory, but times were very troubled there. Lots of difficulties for free people of color, as well as those who had self-manumitted. And many left that area and came to southwestern Ontario as things got tougher. This is another one of their daughters, Ada Larter. I like to include her photo just because she's so lovely. And as you can see, the photo of my great-great-grandmother was taken at Murdoch in Windsor. And we're getting to the end of my little family story, and then I'll move on to the real topic. This is Irene Dunn Christian, my great-grandmother. She was just as adorable as I am. As you can see. This is her as a slightly older child with her younger sister, Vivian Marguerite. This is her as a grown person with whom I'd like to have tea, living in Windsor. And this is my great-grandfather, Thomas Christian, and his siblings. This was taken in Windsor as well. And they grew up in Anderden. Most of them ended up living in Windsor. So just to give you some context around sort of how my family got here, and there are so many family stories that are very similar to that. So when we're looking at Essex County African Canadian settlements from the 19th century, it's very often the case that many of us who have African descent, who have had some longstanding ancestry in this region, have people that have come from a variety of these settlements. Okay, so I'm going to start with just the overview. I mean, it's certainly well understood that in the Underground Railroad era, there were thousands of people of African descent who made their way across the Detroit River to freedom in this area. It's one of the reasons why the National Monument to the Underground Railroad is located here in Windsor, near the riverfront. But Amherstburg was actually a more serious crossing point. Sandwich was as well. Some people crossed through the lake and got to areas in the southern part of the county. And when we talk about the movement of people of African descent into what's now Essex County, we're talking about both formerly enslaved people and people who were free people of color, but who needed to get out of a system of oppression, fear of kidnapping and re-enslavement or enslavement for the first time. And prior to that, we're talking about some Black loyalists as well. So all of those groups. And certainly we had people who were enslaved right here in Essex County and then gained their freedom. Many of the people who entered Essex County in the Underground Railroad era tended to stay close to the border, close to the waterways where they could be easily found by family members, but also where there were plentiful jobs. There was a great agricultural business. There were lots of things going on that made this a great place to live. But some moved further into the interior where there were more farming opportunities and job opportunities, and certainly less fear of aggressive slave catchers. I think I saw a hand up a moment ago. Was there a question that I didn't answer? No. Stop me if you need to ask a question. I will try to be more prompt with my response to that. So when we look at the Black population of Essex County, it was enumerated at 1,871, or 11.2% of the total population in 1851. In 1861, it was enumerated as 2,381, or 9.5% of the total population. Of course, these census figures were lower than a lot of contemporary estimates. And when we think about census taking, there are a number of reasons you can point to why that might be the case. Sometimes people didn't want to have a part in having their whereabouts recorded for reasons you can understand. Sometimes the somewhat transient situation of some laborers made it difficult for them to be captured in quite the right way in terms of the numbers. But what we know is that people who we would consider Black pioneers in this county settled in many places along the river, such as Anderden, Gosfield, Colchester, Harrow, Fort Malden, Amherstburg, Windsor, Sandwich, and so on. So when we look at Amherstburg, obviously Amherstburg had been around since 1796. It was named after the original fort on the site. And there were people of African descent in Amherstburg from very early times. The first United Empire Loyalist settlers to arrive in Amherstburg at the end of the 18th century had included some slaveholders. We think of people like Matthew Elliott, who is known to have owned more than 60 enslaved Africans. There were other slave owners in the Amherstburg area that we kind of hear about as founders of the communities around here. John Askin, Alexander Duff, Simon Gertie, Richard Pattinson, some of those kinds of names, often considered the founders of these communities. Almost since the founding of the Fort Mulligan Amherstburg settlements, there were residents of African descent. However, not all of the early Black residents were enslaved. There were free Blacks such as William Lee and Thomas Fry, who had settled in the area as early as the 1790s. By 1820, there were 5 Black families residing in the town of Amherstburg itself, and by 1828, there were 100 Blacks living in Amherstburg and Malden Township. There was an abolitionist captain by the name of Charles Stewart, of whom some of you may have heard. He estimated that about 150 refugees had come to Amherstburg while he resided there from 1817 to 1822. It's not known how many of them stayed in the town. He went on to set up a colony for African American refugees on land he'd been granted in Amherstburg for his military service. So that kind of predates a lot of people's understanding of when Black people started to arrive in the area, right? In December 1837, during the Mackenzie Rebellion, some of you may know that Reverend Josiah Henson's company of Black volunteers attached to the Essex militia were part of the group that captured the rebel schooner Anne and made prisoners of her crew. Henson's unit defended Fort Mulligan from Christmas 1837 to May 1838. And then there was another company of Black volunteers that was stationed there for 2 months subsequently. The Black volunteers showed so much bravery that Lieutenant Governor Sir Francis Bontemps commented on their service in his remarks to the legislature of Upper Canada in March 1838. So there was a great deal of contribution taking place, and at the same time, interracial relations weren't perfect. Even then, in 1835, paranoid white residents petitioned the government of Upper Canada not to remove British troops from Fort Mulligan, fearing that they would be left defenseless against the very numerous and troublesome Black populations who are almost daily violating the laws. Sounded a lot like certain campaign rhetoric we've heard lately. I'm sorry to bring that up. I won't do it again. Black citizens of Amherstburg in the 1830s and 40s included an innkeeper, a tobacconist, a shoemaker, a miller, and of course Levi Foster, of whom some of you may have heard. He owned a plastering business, a tavern, a livery stable, several homes and lots, a farm in Anderton. There were Black mechanics, barbers, grocery owners, teamsters, lots of laborers and sailors. Certainly you're familiar with the name Asa McCurdy. The McCurdy family had come from Pennsylvania to Essex County. They were free people of color, and he practiced carpentry and became a trustee of the public school board as well. So there's a long history of Black presence in Amherstburg that has a lot of meaning and a great sense of contribution there. But Amherstburg was well known to Americans too. In the September 23, 1842 issue of the Western Citizen of Chicago, it was stated that, in quotes, there are over $400,000 worth of Southern slaves in a town near Malden, Canada. So they were tabulating the value of these people that were living in what we think of as Amherstburg. And American slave owners were nervous enough to propagate ominous myths about this area. One slave, William Johnson, who fled from Virginia, reported having been told that the Detroit River was over 3,000 miles wide, that a ship starting out in the night would find itself in the morning right where it started from. There were stories about sea monsters. That was before the toxins, so there were really stories. And, it was really a place that American slave owners were aware of. And so populous was the Black population in Amherstburg, and so continuous was the heavy influx of refugees that by 1848, Amherstburg was the regional headquarters for the American Missionary Society's operations in Canada, which was a big deal because the American Missionary Society in the Underground Railroad era, at the height of it, had operations in many parts of Canada. So in the 1851 census, it was indicated that there were 205 Blacks residing in Amherstburg. But in 1853, it was reported at the convention of the Amherstburg Regular Missionary Baptist Association that there were about 600 Black settlers in Amherstburg. By 1871, Black people represented 15.5% of the total population in Amherstburg. So that gives you some sense of what was going on there. It was a major area of settlement. Let's move on to Colchester and Harrow. In Colchester Township on the northern shore of Lake Erie, the Black presence began with a few scattered enslaved individuals imported by white United Empire loyalists. And it's also worthwhile to note that in 1787, there were Black loyalists who arrived in the Colchester area, such as John Top, Prince Robinson, and James Fry. So they resettled as free Blacks in Upper Canada. From 1819 onward, a section of Colchester Township at the corner of Drummond and 3rd Concession Roads was populated by people of African descent, and it became known as the Matthews Settlement. Of course, subsequent Underground Railroad activity dramatically increased the Black population of Colchester Township. By 1852, the Anti-Slavery Society of Canada was estimating that there were between 1,200 and 1,500 Blacks residing in Colchester. However, the 1850 to 51 census reported only 533 Black people residing in Colchester. The early Black residents of Colchester included the aforementioned Reverend Josiah Henson. He escaped with his family to Canada in 1830, stayed at Fort Erie for a time, and settled in Colchester, establishing a communal farm on rented land with other formerly enslaved people. He witnessed a lot of mistreatment of the Black residents by greedy landowners. He noticed, for example, that they were getting sucked into unscrupulous land deals and things of that nature. And this really contributed to his dream of establishing a self-supporting Black community where people could get agricultural skills training and learn to own and manage their own farm operations. That was the inspiration for the Dunn settlement, which Henson ultimately established at Dresden in 1842, as many of you already know. When we look at the people in Colchester, I think that we often think of Delos Rajas Davis too. How many of you know the name Delos Rajas Davis? A few. That's cool. So Delos Rajas Davis was born in 1846 in Maryland. He was raised on property that his formerly enslaved father bought in Colchester Township. Like many African American migrants to the area, he worked as a deckhand and a fireman on local ships until he was able to pay for his post-secondary education. He began as a teacher, and then he decided that he wanted to become a lawyer after teaching school for about 4 years at the Gilgal settlement. Prejudice prevented Davis from articling with a lawyer, so after 11 years of trying to obtain a placement, he has to be given special permission to write the bar examination via an act of the Ontario legislature. That occurred in 1884, and it was called an act to authorize the Supreme Court of Judicature of Ontario to admit Delos Rajas Davis to practice as a solicitor. He established law offices in Amherstburg and Windsor and served as a town solicitor for Amherstburg and Anderson and Colchester North. And he's believed to have been the first Black lawyer in the British Empire to be appointed a King's Counsel. We think of that story often, those of us who study Black history in the area, for a number of reasons, of which one is the marvel of this individual who was born into a situation of slavery, but who obviously was able to overcome all of these circumstances and become a truly well-respected lawyer. And of course, we can't help thinking of all the people who were denied those opportunities. When we look at Colchester, certainly in terms of the population, we know that there was an adequate population to establish several churches. We have abandoned cemeteries that kind of attest now to much of the population that existed there. The settlement known as Gilgal, which is now part of the amalgamated town of Essex, is an area where there was a Black pioneer cemetery that we can still find. In 1852, the Voice of the Fugitive reported that there were several schools in Canada West run by the A&E Church. One of them was at Gilgal. And as I mentioned, future attorney Irene Davis taught there too. The settlement that was once known as New Canaan is along Malden Road in Colchester North Township, and it's now part of the amalgamated town of Essex. The first settlers of New Canaan were transplanted to African Americans who had escaped from slavery in the American South. The name given to the settlement in the 1820s kind of speaks to their self-concept as people guided by God to a new land of hope. And the Anti-Slavery Society of Canada reported that there were 20 families residing at New Canaan in 1852. It had its own Baptist church and its own British Methodist Episcopal church. And there's still some abandoned tombstones that you can find there today. Gosfield Township was another early African Canadian settlement. One of the earliest records of a Black presence in Gosfield Township relates to, among other things, a criminal case. Following the American Revolutionary War, James Gertie, who was a United Empire Loyalist, settled in Gosfield Township East, bringing with them his enslaved Africans. These slaves are believed to have been captured during the war and treated as personal booty rather than prisoners of war. One of them was Jack York, who in 1800 was charged with burglary with intent to commit a felony. He was convicted at Sandwich and sentenced to death, but he escaped, which I've always thought would make the excellent basis for a novel or something, if anyone is game. By the mid-19th century, there were free people of color, refugees from American slavery, who were beginning to live in the fertile territories of Gosfield Township. There was a degree of prosperity there, and in the mid-1850s, it was reported that of 78 Black settlers in Gosfield, the majority of the heads of households were property owners. They were able to stay in a Black Baptist church, and there's certainly a cemetery, an abandoned cemetery along Division Road near Kingsville, which is a clue to the once thriving immigrant community that was there. Certainly, we can move on to the shores of Lake St. Clair, and I know that there's a great deal of knowledge about the Black presence in Maidstone Township. The wealthy and powerful John Askin, who's usually associated with Amherstburg and Sandwich, also had major landholdings in Maidstone Township, and he kept a number of enslaved Africans there. However, Underground Railroad activity dramatically increased the size of the population in that area. For example, there were brothers named Tom and Granville Lawson. They escaped slavery in Kentucky and settled in Maidstone Township in 1833. They acquired some land by the Puce River and Pikes Creek, where they earned their living from the lumber business. Together, they owned a single-masted schooner, which they used to transport lumber to Detroit. Think about that, because these are two formerly enslaved people who are now running a business that requires them to go back and forth to Detroit, to America. Very brave. And I'm sure that many of you are familiar with the story of John Freeman Walls and his family. He was a self-emancipated, formerly enslaved person from North Carolina, and his wife Jane was believed to be white. They were important early settlers who made their way to Amherstburg before settling in Maidstone Township in about 1846. By 1845, they had a log cabin, 2 oxen, 8 cows, 3 sheep, 6 horses, 2 dogs, and 25 acres of land. The dogs obviously being the most important part of that. Within a few years, they were raising 500 bushels of wheat, 150 bushels of potatoes, 75 bushels of peas, 100 bushels of oats, and so on. And of course, that history is described very well in a book called The Road That Led to Somewhere by Dr. Brian Walls. I'm sure some of you have seen it or read it, and it's the main focus of the John Freeman Walls Historic Site and Museum in Lakeshore. That's just one example of some of the prosperity that took place, that took hold among the African Canadian community there. By the 1850s, there was already a substantial African Canadian community along the Baseline Road and south of it. The community was the primary source of hired help for the Scottish farmers in the Puce area. In the early 1850s, the Refugee Home Society was formed to settle formerly enslaved Blacks along the Detroit River frontier in Canada West. The goal was to sell Canadian land to Black refugees from American slavery. It was founded in 1851 by Michigan abolitionists, but it merged in 1852 with the Windsor-based Fugitive Union Society. And many people associate the Refugee Home Society with one particular individual, Henry Bibb, about whom I will talk when we get to Sandwich. The society tended to purchase land in areas where there was already some settlement as opposed to abandoned wilderness areas. So the areas along Lake St. Clair, which were settled by refugee home societies, included Maidstone in Rochester Township, Bell River, Little River, Spruce River, Pikes Creek, Maidstone, and Hughes. Often the individuals who purchased those lands were able to work on other farms as day laborers, making a decent living due to the pretty hefty shortage of agricultural labor at the time. And by 1861, 60 families had settled on 100 refugee home society lots. And many of those individuals have descendants who are still in the area today. Of course, when we talk about all of these settlements, we realize that many of them became depopulated to some degree or to a large degree after the Civil War and with industrialization and the lure of jobs in the cities. So let's move on to Windsor, since we're here. Although nearby Sandwich was the capital of the Western District of Upper Canada since the 1790s, there have been Black residents in Windsor, or the Ferry, since at least the 1830s. Black volunteers were instrumental in the recapture of the Ferry on December 4th, 1838, when it was invaded briefly during the rebellion. Whereas for a few decades, Amherstburg had been the chief point of entry into Canada West for people of African descent, something that was well documented by many writers of the time who were interested in the anti-slavery issues. There was a dramatic increase in Black emigration to Windsor in the 1850s for a couple of reasons. It was an area where there was growing industry and commerce. And it created the need for relief associations to begin assisting the refugees here in Windsor. So in the early 1850s, as some of you already know, there were abandoned military barracks on what's now the grounds of Windsor City Hall Square. And those were used to house newly arrived refugees from American slavery. I kind of think of it as Windsor's Ellis Island. Most of them only had to stay there a short while until funding or finding employment in better housing and being able to sustain themselves. And so that was the location where Marianne Shadd decided to open a school to educate Black children and youth. Often during the evening hours, there were adults who went to the school as well, trying to gain some literacy. And so that's considered a very important site in downtown Windsor. In 1855, the visiting American abolitionist Benjamin Drew declared that 259 of Windsor's 1,400 residents were Black. By 1859, the general population of Windsor was between 2,500 and 3,000, and it was estimated by Reverend William Mitchell that 700 to 800 of those residents were of African ancestry. By 1867, there were over 600 Blacks in Windsor, according to the assessment rolls, and African Canadians made up 20.6% of the total population in Windsor by 1871. So you do hear a lot about Windsor Black history for sure. And lastly, Sandwich. Sandwich, as I'm sure all of you know, was founded by white Americans who moved across the Detroit River after the American Revolution, moving on to lands that had previously been in the possession of the French and prior to them indigenous peoples. A number of those loyalists brought with them their enslaved Africans. It was the location of one of the homes of the wealthy and powerful John Askin, whose slave, Joseph Cutton, became the first person to die on the gallows in Upper Canada. That was a result of allegedly stealing rum and furs from a Detroit merchant. In the early 1850s, African-American abolitionists like Henry and Mary Bibb began to choose Sandwich as the base of operations for their anti-slavery activities. Henry and Mary Bibb chose that as the location for their newspaper, The Voice of the Fugitive. From his vantage point at the busy Detroit River crossing, Bibb was able to comment with pretty awesome regularity on the numbers of refugees crossing into Sandwich, ranging from 15 per week to as many as 65 in one day at the height of the Underground Railroad. And certainly Sandwich was the place where a young lady named Caroline Quarles Watkins settled as well. I don't know how familiar you are with her story, but she was a woman of just 16 when she left St. Louis and made her way to Sandwich. She's considered the matriarch of the whole Watkins family. So many of the Watkins you might know, those in the Sandwich area and outside of it, are descendants of Caroline Quarles Watkins. In 1852, the Anti-Slavery Society of Canada estimated that there were 300 blacks residing in Sandwich. And rather unusually, the census of 1851 actually reported a higher figure for the black population in Sandwich, 407 persons. In some of these communities where black settlements once existed, you really don't see any signs of those black settlements other than imperceptible, weather-worn grave markers and abandoned cemeteries. However, descendants of some of the immigrant communities remain in large numbers in Amherstburg, Colchester, Puce, and Windsor, inclusive of Sandwich, of course. I definitely want to recommend that everyone reads a book called A Fluid Frontier, Slavery, Resistance, and the Underground Railroad in the Detroit River Borderlands. It's available through the Windsor Public Library system, or you can buy it, of course. There were 13 authors who contributed chapters to the book, and it does give a really great overview of Underground Railroad and slavery history in the Detroit River region on both sides of the water. And just to close, I want to say that it's Black History Month, of course. Many of us have a great deal of knowledge that we've acquired over the years, and that includes many in this room. And it's great to hold on to the knowledge, but I would just encourage everyone to share some information with the young people in your lives, to encourage them to look into this information. For youth in particular, of all races and backgrounds, knowledge of our collective history is terribly important. And there is a great deal that we can all learn from this particular history of people of African descent. It's certainly inspiring, but it also really demonstrates that there are many gifts and opportunities that Canada has provided over the years, and that anyone can make use of them. And I'm going to turn this back over to the chair. Thank you so much.
Don't go anywhere for a moment. I would like to take this opportunity before Irene finishes up with this, some questions, I hope, to thank her very much on behalf of the Essex branch of the OGS for a most interesting and informative presentation tonight. Thank you very much for that presentation. And I'd like to, on behalf of the branch, present you with that.
Thank you so much.
Questions?
Yes.
The emancipation happened in 1834. When was the emancipation?
August 1st, 1833 was when the legislation was passed.
Okay. Do you know any stories of what happened to the slaves in our area at that time? Did they just get employment? Like if they were a house slave, did they just start getting paid for doing the same job? Or did they move out of the area and say, I'm going to go find a job someplace else? Like, what kind of stories have you got that way?
I'm going to encourage the other members of the Essex County Black Historical Society to jump in if I miss anything in the answer. Okay, that's cool. That's good. I love questions. Questions keep us hopping. So keep in mind that in Upper Canada, we actually limited slavery prior to 1833, right? You have the legislation, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of the law, but in the 1790s, you have the legislation that was championed by Sir John Graves Simcoe to limit slavery in Upper Canada, not abolish it, but limit it, so that people who were living in a situation of slavery, who were adults, would be held in slavery, until whenever. If they were under the age of 21, they were to be freed when they were 21. And the bill or the law actually banned the importation of new slaves into Upper Canada. In theory, Although we know that there were some gray areas where people were still bringing slaves in. For example, we know of an enslaved person named James Ford who had been enslaved in Kentucky, bought his freedom, was captured and brought up to Detroit and sold to a military officer, a British military officer, and was brought into Upper Canada, living in Amherstburg after that 1793 legislation. So there are some gray areas there. We know that because Brian Prince, a great historian, has done that work. And so what often happened was that people who were living in slavery in Upper Canada used the Underground Railroad in reverse to go across the Detroit River or Lake Erie or other bodies to get into the United States to seek freedom. There are apparently not many known examples of slave trading continuing in Upper Canada after the 18-teens. But there were certainly some individuals who were still living in slavery as Underground Railroad individuals were coming into freedom in Upper Canada. And so that must have been so unusual to go and seek freedom in what is now Ontario and find yourself in a society where there were still enslaved people living around you. Did I answer your question? Ken?
I don't remember the source, but I remember reading that Matthew Elliott's slaves in Irinsburg the year before they found out about legislation. I don't remember where I read that, but I just remember pretty shocked when I read it.
But slavery was certainly dying out in Upper Canada by the point when the British Empire ended it.
And Ken's point, of course, Matthew Elliott still owned slaves at the War of 1812.
Yeah.
They were enslaved in spite of that legislation. Mm-hmm. So I'm assuming, well, one, he captured American slaves and brought them here as war booty.
Yeah.
But then my question is a separate to Deb's. I'm assuming that when the Americans were coming and Matthew Elliott was escaping, he just didn't abandon his slaves. He took them with him because they were his property as he was trying to escape with Proctor. So I'm assuming he took them with him. Of course, they didn't necessarily go with him on the one hand, but on the when it's falling away. On the other hand, if the Americans captured them, the Americans who were invading would have just probably enslaved every single black they came upon because they were Kentucky militia, et cetera. And every black person they found, free or not, would have become a slave. Any tale on that, on the Elliott slaves?
It's so funny. I don't, but Ken has his hand up.
Well, of course it does. Well, I think also to remember that Matthew Elliott, when did he die?
Oh, 1820 something after
1813. He died in Hamilton.
Yeah.
Burlington.
Yeah, after taking the rock. You're right.
Because I seem to remember too that the widow and the son seem to be on the property.
Yes.
Still has that.
Okay, well, she rebuilt a very nice house which still exists.
In 1836.
And probably by then she didn't have slaves.
She wouldn't have slaves.
Not by then. But yes, she did come back.
1851 census, some of the people that were servants of hers were the pensioners, the British soldier pensioners that came into the area at that point. They were, he
But they would have been servants.
they were servants,
But
they
that's
weren't slaves,
No,
yeah.
Of course not.
But that's 51.
51. But that, my question was, basically, what happened to the slaves he had as he was escaping in 1813 following Proctor? I mean, that's a pretty tough question to ask for him, John, but I thought maybe they might be some information. That's a really tough one.
I can't imagine that they would any quantities of slaves with that kind of
No.
Okay, I could see a few personal servants.
Yeah, that's what I thought. 2 or 3 might have gone with him, cooperating, because there was as much working for him as, even though they were paid, as loyal to him, as much as the skill set, he probably just ran away. I was in my mind.
It's certainly worth exploring, but I've not seen
No,
it.
that's something that I'm chasing around today.
Okay, sure, absolutely. And can I add something about that just really briefly, though? Carolyn Smarts-Frost, with whom I'm sure you're all familiar, has found really interesting evidence of the Kentucky militia people coming up here, bringing enslaved people with them, who then took the word back to Kentucky that there were these free black people here in red coats fighting in the War of 1812, and that this may have actually contributed to the flow of Underground Railroad refugees coming this way.
Because they were free employees, soldiers of the crown.
Okay, you had your hand up, Cindy.
I just wondered if there was any type of warning system in place, so when they were crossing across to come and gather their property, was the word spread?
Yes, what would happen was people would turn on their TVs and there would be this buzzy sound that would in the military spring hour, there would just be this warning sound, emergency broadcast.
No.
Yeah, right, it was just black and white. No, in all seriousness, and I don't have proof of this, there are stories that circulate that may be plausible, that in terms of, for example, when slave catchers were moving through the area looking for their former property or the property of the people who had hired them, people would use songs. There were certainly bells used. The Liberty Bell in Broxton, for example, was used as a warning system at times. It was used to announce the arrival of new refugees into the area, but it was also used to warn individuals when there was some sort of danger. So I mean, people had all kinds of informal ways, but if it was one system used everywhere, it would have been too easy to figure out. Okay, any other questions?
Hi, Lee. I'm interested in our presentation. We're from Caribbean. I'm from the Caribbean, and slavery was very relevant in the Caribbean, as you know. That's not my question, but that's another whole area. My question is, what part of the church on Peter Street is the Baptist church there? What part of that church played on the road? I heard that they play very important.
We have with us one of the former exceptional tour guides from that church who ran their history tour program for years, so Gail, jump in at any point. Okay, so let's just acknowledge Gail Gardner. But Sandwich First Baptist was built by formerly enslaved people. It was actually built brick by formerly enslaved people, and it's the only place in our city limits that is still a remaining Underground Railroad era structure built by people of African descent. There were many churches like that, but they no longer are around in Windsor. So it's a very special place to visit. That's one of the places where there are many stories of the church being used to shelter people who were being sought by slave catchers on this side. I mean, it was very easy for slave catchers to cross into Windsor or Sandwich or these areas along the border and search for what they considered their stolen property. And so there are stories of Sandwich First Baptist being used as a place that sheltered formerly enslaved people, not just as a worship station. And there are stories of music being used in Sandwich First Baptist Church to kind of warn people in the church and in the area when there was some danger around. Unfortunately, those can't be documented, but those stories certainly circulate. But it was clearly a very important spiritual center for the community of African descent in that time. And each of these communities, and I think it's true of many immigrant communities, regardless of the ethnocultural background, but one of the first priorities was to build houses of worship as soon as they could. They would meet informally, but as soon as they had that opportunity to build churches, they did so. And often what remains of these communities are things affiliated with the churches in those communities, even if they've been entirely depopulated by now. Any other questions? Yes.
To elaborate on the church in September, doors open usually has that church on their tour, and it's worthwhile tour to go on. They tell you the story about it as well as they show you where they used to hide this stuff. And it's very educational.
You are absolutely right. And if you can't wait that long, if you are just in suspense, I believe that on Saturday, February 25th, they will be doing the same thing. So you can go there Saturday the 25th. I forget the hours, but if you go to AmherstFreedom.org and look at the calendar, it's there. Thank you. Okay, one last question. Yes.
You mentioned Raleigh Township. Where is Raleigh Township?
Oh, Raleigh Township is in Chatham Kent. So I did touch a little bit on some Chatham Kent sites, just in terms of my own personal history. So Raleigh Township is in Chatham Kent, and it's just on the border of what's now known as Broxton, or what used to be known as the Elgin Settlement. So you would get there by turning off at Bloomfield Road and heading down the concession. So yes, thank you. Yeah.
Just a comment, a very thorough, detailed presentation.
Thank you. And I want to acknowledge that Ken Stanton was the person who gave me the wonderful idea for making maps that have the places identified on them. We did a presentation together where we did that years ago, so I expanded on that, and I do want to thank him for that. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Irene, I'd like to again thank you very much for sharing wonderful stories and information with us tonight. I think we all have learned a good deal more, and I'm sure going to research some of the books and read the books that you have recommended. It's always a learning process, and we appreciate the time you've taken to come and speak to us tonight. Thank you. If you again would like some free reading on the back table there, please, there's no hurry to rush out. Sit and talk with your colleagues, chat. We would like to have it back next month as well. Thank you.
Thank you.